Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. This week, my guest is Nazanin Afshar Szanto. Nazanin is a mixed-race Persian, Indigenous, Central American, and white queer based in the California Bay Area. Nazanin is an emotional and spiritual healer using tarot readings and channeling spirits as their primary practice modalities. Today we discuss the importance of spirituality in queer communities and using different kinds of healing as tools for liberation. We also explore what it means to be radically vulnerable and the importance of expanding boundaries. Find more about Nazanin at healingwithnazanin.com. That's NAZANIN.com. Hi, Nazanin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Hello.
I'm excited to have you here and hear more about the work that you do. So I wanted to start out by asking you, how did you first discover the practices of divination and spiritual healing that you use in your work?
Okay. So I think I started life as like a very religious child. My mother is actually Assyrian, which is kind of like an offset of Judaism. It's kind of like Middle Eastern Christianity, to put it in a way that makes sense for Western terms. So when I was born, like I went to church. We went to church 4 days a week. You know, we had like Sunday school, Saturday school, Bible study, choir. I don't know. There was just tons. There was a lot of like structured religion that was happening in my life at the time. And because of that, I was raised and taught spirituality in one very strict way, because that's kind of how it is. It's like there's one road to this destination, and any other roads outside of this road are non-legitimate because the Bible says so. So as I got older, I think in like my early teenage years, I just was very curious and inquisitive about structured religion, and the church doesn't really leave room for that in general. So I kind of pushed away from it because I had questions that didn't have answers. And I spent like the next maybe 10, 15 years of my life without having any spiritual practices, because I was so like adverse to spirituality and religion due to my experience in the church. And I got into my early 20s, and I had always been a really sensitive and empathic person. That's just, you know, like I'm good at picking up on how people are feeling, or just situations. Like if there's a tense situation, I'll be really sensitive to what's going on. So I had a friend who practices Ifa. It's Yoruba African diasporic spirituality. And they had a tarot deck. And every time I came over to their house, they always were like joshing with me and joking. They're like, you need to use this deck. You should really try it. I think you should try. And for, you know, maybe 3 years, I was like, no, not interested. I don't think that that's for me. And then one day I just did it. Like I was like, all right, I'll give it a try and see how it is. And I sat there for probably like 2 hours, just shuffling through cards and looking into the tarot books. And after that, it kind of just took off. It just grew from that point on, I guess I would say. That person actually got me my own first tarot deck. And I started doing like just divination for my friends. And it wasn't until about a year later when I realized what that really meant and how that was linked to my relationship with my intuition and with my higher self or spirit. So that's kind of how it happened.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know, because I always think that can be an interesting correlation, particularly for queer people who really question their spirituality or the religion that they were brought up. If there's a parallel process or a correlation to when they come out or when they start to explore their queerness versus when they explore their alternative or new spiritual practices. And I'm wondering what that was like for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think right around the time that I started to reject Christianity, like that was like preteen, early teen, like 12 or 13 years old. I also had like my first queer crush at that same time, like 13. And it was really confusing because via my parents, I'd had like the word of God struck into my heart. And it was this like horrifically terrifying thing to even consider that I might be anything but cisgender and heterosexual. So, and I do think that like having no religious and spiritual practices for those teenage years was a part of my like spiritual journey. So I'd say that in that way, it really coincided because I just rejected religion wholly because I was like, this says I'm not allowed to be this way that I think I probably am. And if that's what this is about, then I don't want to have anything to do with it because this is contradictory. And even though I'm a preteen, like I said, I'm curious and I like lining these things up and I'm asking questions and it's just not something that's super encouraged. And then in my early 20s, like right when I was starting to engage in divination is when I came out as genderqueer or non-binary. So there was a lot of like correlating between changing my understanding of spirituality and changing my understanding of social constructs because they're kind of, in a lot of ways, they coincide. Religion is like structured religion is a social construct. So is gender, so is sexuality. So I would say that.
And are there particular traditions or practices that you use now?
Yes. So I'm what they consider a chaos witch. Basically, for folks who don't know, is just I have picked and choose like out of different practices what works for me, and that's my own thing. So I really encourage folks who are interested in spirituality to just do what feels right. And I've just never been comfortable with like a really structured way of thinking about spirit and religion and spirituality. So I think also because I'm mixed race and American, and there just isn't one set path that ever felt right for me. I think there's many paths to the same destination. So I've taken a little bit of Santeria, and I've taken a little bit of Christianity even, and a little bit of just my own, just figuring stuff out as I go and accepting that some stuff's going to work for me and some stuff's not. So it's just a combination of everything that I've encountered in my life.
And so right now you said that the primary practices that you're using in your healing work is tarot and channeling and ancestral healing work. What kinds of things are you seeing people bring to you these days?
There are definitely a lot of patterns in the stuff that folks are dealing with in our communities, in the queer and trans community and in communities of color. I think one thing that I see a lot that I've been thinking about a lot as well is the lack of boundaries, like lack of healthy boundaries in general. I found that as I grow and as I'm working through stuff in my life, usually what happens is the folks who come to me for my services are a reflection of what I am working through. So right now, that's been a lot of boundary work and a lot of like healing the child self and like childhood trauma. Yeah. And I know boundaries is like very general, but it shows up in a lot of similar ways. Like it shows up with folks having relationships where they're being taken advantage of and not having relationships where there's a lot of reciprocity, especially for highly sensitive people. It can show up in the physical world and in the metaphysical world. So they'll come to me and they'll be like super overstimulated on a regular basis. And I'm like, yeah, because you have literally no boundaries. Like you're being bombarded by people and spirits and energy like all at once, all the time. And everybody's like asking and taking from you on a regular basis. And you are just out there like raw in the rain without a raincoat.
Yeah, I've noticed that some people I work with who fall under that description, that it's really just about teaching them how to say no and to be okay saying no, and that saying no to a person in a body is also saying no to a person not in a body.
Yep.
And just getting used to that idea.
Yeah.
And then I also talk to people about boundaries in terms of not only being firm in terms of not letting anything in terms of like external energy or contact with other people, but also about how much they let out. And so sometimes it can be people draining energy and putting too much out, or sometimes it's not putting enough out. And I could see how that can also be really important for queer people right now in terms of putting ourselves out there more and taking space and being heard and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that.
So along those lines, I know that you also wanted to talk a little bit about healing as a liberation tool. And I wonder if you could share how you see that and how you work with that.
Yeah. So there's this term, I think it's like radical vulnerability or like radical sensitivity. Either way, it's the idea that we live in a world, especially with like capitalism and white supremacy and Westernness, that teaches us to be hard all the time. And not so much in the sense in which we're talking about boundaries, but like emotionally hard. Like we can't be vulnerable, and it's dangerous for us to be sensitive, and being sensitive and crying, like those things are weak. And if you're sad, that's like toxic, and it's like negativity, and everyone wants to be on this like positive wave, like positive vibes all the time. And it's just not a reflection of like how we are as human beings. It's not really living authentically, and I think it causes like more pain than it actually does any good. And I understand like why it happens. Like I understand why people are really hesitant to open up and be vulnerable and express their emotions and their feelings, but it's literally an offset of capitalism. Like this is learned behavior. And I guess I just like to push people and question them and ask them like, what would happen if you showed up authentically? Like what would happen if you were really vulnerable and honest about how you're feeling? What would happen if you actually cared about other people? Like if you had the capacity to do so and you were healed enough to provide space for people to be vulnerable as well. So I think that in a world that's like constantly traumatizing us and damaging us, one of the most radical things that we can do is heal and reclaim our sensitivity and our vulnerability and our tenderness, because we're very sweet and tender little beings, and we get hurt, and then hurt people hurt other people, and it's just a cycle, and we need to break it if we're serious about liberation.
Mm-hmm. And something else I've seen within the system that you're talking about, especially with all the ways that capitalism imposes on us, is that we easily turn to habits and behaviors to numb out or sort of shut down. And I think that using healing work and spirituality, particularly for queer people, is a way to find support when we are numbing out or when we are feeling lost or confused or alone. And so I'm really glad that you are bringing this work to the community to support them in this way.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that it can be really isolating, just being queer in America, let alone folks usually have other intersectional identities. And healing, I want to say that just like healing work is not butterflies and rainbows at all. It's actually a lot of it, I would say like 90% of it is shadow work, which involves going into the deepest, darkest, ugliest parts of ourselves, the part that we're trying to numb when we're trying to get away from it, and like holding space for those emotions so that we can work through it and move on. So it's not to be taken like lightly. Like this work is not for the faint of heart. You have to be brave. You have to be ready to challenge things that you didn't even know were going to come up, and you have to be fearless. Like you have to be fearlessly emotional.
And even though I'm just meeting you here in this context, I have a sense that you have a lot of strength that you bring to your clients to help them through that. I just get a sense of you have a very sort of solid, grounded presence that I imagine really helps the people that you work with.
Yeah, I worked really, really hard to get to that point. And it's actually a boundary thing. Because
Say more about that.
Yeah, well, so like I said in the beginning, I've always been a really sensitive person. And when I started kind of expanding my there's a lot of words to describe the same thing. But when I started to expand my empathic abilities or my psychic abilities, I didn't have boundaries because I literally did not know what they were. And there were times where I would come home and I would just start feeling sick, like physically ill. Like I would have a stomach ache and I felt nauseous, or I'd get a migraine. And it always felt so weird. Like it didn't totally feel like it was my stuff that I was taking on. And it didn't take me that long to figure out that I was taking on physical symptoms of like my housemates' stuff. Like if I had a housemate that was really anxious and so they had a stomach ache, then I would get a stomach ache. If I had a housemate that was like super depressed and had gotten a migraine headache, then I would get a headache. And that just goes to show like how really powerful this stuff can be, but it's just not sustainable. Like it's not sustainable at all to exist like that and to be constantly holding other people's feelings in our bodies. Like that's not what healers should be doing, and that's not what highly sensitive people should be doing. So I just worked hard to be able to feel how people are feeling, but also not to take their pain and their emotions into my body. Like I can hold space for their emotions outside of my body and validate them, but I will not accept those things to come inside to my spiritual and my emotional body.
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I just want to say it again because we're talking about it right now, and I think it's so important, which is that I think that queer people in particular, because of the way that we are raised in environments of oppression or homophobia, that we train ourselves to be sensitive in that way as a way of safety and protection. So we can sort of read what's going on in the environment with other people. Mm-hmm. But as we go on through life, if we don't learn to have boundaries around that or titrate that ability in some way, it can become overwhelming. So I think it's really important to work on that. And I'm curious, do you ever work with your clients around those issues?
Yes, I do. My favorite thing with like when it comes to my clients, what I like the most and the type of relationships that I'm trying to cultivate are long-term clientele. So there are folks that I'll like do oracle or tarot readings for where it's like their first time. I'll just do a house cleansing for someone. But my favorite thing to do is work with other folks that are like me and do like long-term work. So, you know, we start with opening up like what's going on with them. And then I help them with boundary work if that's what's coming up, or help them connect to their own individual spirituality or heal their relationship with their ancestors. Like there's a lot of different things that I've just found little ways that work for me that I can share with them. So I'm kind of like a therapist, a life coach, and a mentor all packaged into one, with no degrees except backing by spirit and very powerful deities and my ancestors.
Yeah. Can you share one of the ways that you begin to work with people around boundaries, since that's what we've been talking about?
Yes, definitely. I think the first thing always is to like identify arenas in your life and where there's stuff that's sucking your vitality out. And vitality is like life force. It's what gets us up in the morning. It's our hope, it's our faith, it's our spirit, it's our energy. So you identify kind of like aspects in your life and where that's happening. And it might be your job, it might be a relationship, it might be housemates. It could really be almost anything, because when we talk about boundaries, we have to talk about self-worth and self-care and like how much we're going to tolerate. So I like to walk folks through like, where is your red line? Like, where is the point that you will no longer accept this form of treatment and you'll stand up for yourself and reclaim your space? And after we work through that, sometimes it's just as simple as like sitting with someone. I sat with someone the other day and she sent a text to her mom saying that she wasn't going to come by the house. And for her, that was like monumental. Like, we're talking about, this is generational issues with boundaries and like being constantly accessible to your brown family as a queer person too. So they're just using her for labor. It was this, for us, maybe that's something really simple, but for her it was this huge like accomplishment in this moment. And I was really glad that I was able to be there for that. So it could be something that's super small, like sending a text, but it could also be like teaching people how to do light barriers and light boundaries around them to like ward off spiritual presence that are trying to suck their vitality as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely one thing I've seen with my clients too, is that it can be really hard for people like that to set firm boundaries, especially with family members.
Yeah.
And especially people who come from different cultures where that culture says family comes first and you sacrifice yourself at the sake of your family. And I think there's ways that that gets twisted and abused, and
Yep.
it's not helpful at all. And so it's really hard to help people start to see that and change that, but it can happen.
Absolutely.
So I'm also curious to know how, I mean, we've sort of been talking about it and around it, but I'm curious to know how you see the role of spirituality in queer communities in general.
Yeah, I think that it is actually like of vital importance that everybody has their own practices that bring them like some sort of hope or faith. And it doesn't have to be this rigidly religious or spiritual thing. It doesn't even have to be something that you do like consistently. For me, that's the whole point, is that it's very individualistic. So I see like art and creativity as forms of spirituality and expressing yourself. So sometimes people are doing it without even realizing it. Like maybe your thing is spoken word, and that's how you get your feelings out, and that's how you express yourself. And whether or not you know it, maybe when you're performing spoken word, you're doing healing for yourself and for your ancestors, and they're like witnessing you, and it's this like beautiful thing that's happening, and it's really intimate. So I think that we really need to have these practices that help lift our spirits and connect us to something larger than ourselves, because I worry a lot about our community and about, you know, like we have so many young folks who are dying and don't want to live, and it's just like, it's honestly just the most brutal thing to witness as somebody who has made it through those early teen and 20 years. Breaks my heart. And I understand it. Like this life will really beat you down into the ground, especially if you're like queer and trans and a person of color or disabled. So we have to like collectively find practices and routines that lift our spirits so that we don't let capitalism win in that way, because just existing as a queer person is a form of resistance, and just existing is a revolution on its own. So it's our duty to not just exist to suffer.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say to a younger queer person who, when they hear the word spirituality, they're just like, yeah, I don't think that I need that, or that's not for me, or that's, you know, BS. What would you say to that?
I feel like I would encourage them to explore, because like I said, I see it in so many different ways. I think writing in your journal every day can be a spiritual practice, and washing your hair or taking a bath, like those are spiritual practices. Like cooking and feeding yourself, all of these things are a part of spirituality. And I feel like I would remind them that almost everything that we're taught is not the whole truth, especially in like school as children. So we know that there's the emotional body, like the physical body and the mental body, but there is also the spiritual body, and it's just as relevant and just as important as any of those other sources are. And having like low spiritual vitality can totally lead to having low emotional, mental, or physical vitality. You can get sick, you can be depressed, you can have serious mental health issues. And I'm not saying that spirituality fixes everything. It doesn't. And like I said, it's not easy work. Like a lot of it is just delving through trauma and working on healing and like having a belief system. But it is of vital importance that we find ways to cope. So I think I would say something along the lines of that.
So Nazanin, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
Yes. My most recent therapist, she was the first therapist I ever had a relationship with that was good, like healthy, because as a kid, I had a lot of mandated therapy sessions just from the court because my parents separated, and that's kind of what they do to kids they're worried about. And it was awful. Like a lot of it was just having older folks who I knew didn't really understand me watching me like play with blocks and taking notes. So that's what I thought therapy was for a long time, like forever. I was like, oh, that's not for me. Like maybe for someone else, but for me, that would never work. And I think that's also like there was a lot of unlearning that I had to do because, especially as a mixed race Latino person, I know that my dad played a huge role in like just not seeing the value in that type of healing. So last year, I got really committed to like doing emotional and mental healing, and I found a therapist who was a woman of color, and she wasn't queer, which I was kind of uncomfortable with at first because I was like really trying hard to find someone who had intersecting identities with me. Like I really wanted a queer person, but I also wanted a person of color, and I found that in my like budget range, I could only find queer white folks and straight folks of color. So I had to pick, and I gave it a try, and I asked her about it a lot when I first started. I wanted to make sure that she was going to really come from a place of understanding and compassion as a non-queer person. And it was honestly one of the most rewarding and positive, healthy relationships I've had, I think, in my whole life. She just really did a good job of like pushing me when I needed to be pushed and like holding space for me and my sensitivity when I needed that, and helping me understand boundaries and see patterns and cycles and break them and encourage me. And it was just like, yeah, it was a really all around rewarding experience. And I definitely recommend folks, if they've thought about trying it and they have access to it, they should just give it a try, because you never know what could come out of it. And you could be like me, sitting here and being like, wow, I could have been in therapy for years. But, you know, sometimes it takes a miracle.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as a therapist myself, I'm really happy to hear that you had a good experience with that, because your story of trying to find a queer therapist of color is, and how challenging that is, very familiar to me. And being a queer white therapist myself, I've had people come to me and just like feel like they have to sacrifice a preference that they had. And I totally understand that and empathize with them. And it's just really hard. And that's also part of one of the things that I'm working for in a different way, is to make therapy more accessible. And that's a whole other episode we could talk about. And there's other people having those conversations. But I'm really glad to hear that. And I guess what I'll say for people out there listening, if they're having trouble finding something, is to, I guess, follow Nazanin's lead and take a chance and try to find someone who's going to be as close to what you want as possible, and talk to them about it and ask them questions. And, I'm not sure about how many cities in the country have this, but there are a fair amount of organizations in most major metropolitan areas that have queer therapists that you can search for there and have a database. So for people out there, I would encourage them to look for something like that to start to begin that process, or work with Nazanin.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I honestly learned a lot from my therapist, and I told her that too all the time. I was like, oh, like she would just drop one-liners on me sometimes, the perfect one-liners. And it was all I needed to hear for me to like do a 180 on my mindset about something. So the stuff that she taught me, I will carry with me forever. And it has absolutely impacted me as a healer. And healers need healing too. Healers need healers. So it's just really important to do that work, especially if you are interested in or curious about being a healer yourself.
Mm-hmm. So do you work with people online, remotely, and in person, or just in person?
Yes, I do. I work in person out of Oakland, California, but I do online appointments all the time. I usually do video chat, and I can totally do phone calls too. But I actually like doing video call readings, because it's almost like an extra layer of not taking on someone's emotional stuff for me, because we're like separated physically from each other, but I can still read into the situation. I can still like provide guidance.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I really like doing remote work.
So how can people find you and connect with you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I feel like the main way to get in contact with me is either through my website or my Instagram, and they're both the same. It's Healing with Nazanin, and my name is spelled Nazanin. So on Instagram, it's at Healing with Nazanin, and my website is www.healingwithnazanin.com. And I'm also on Facebook. You can find me under that as well.
Okay, great. Well, I'll have all those in the show notes so people can find them there as well. Well, thank you for being here and sharing about your work. And I hope that you continue to heal our communities and bring queer spirituality into the world.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to connecting with folks that are listening. If you feel drawn towards it, there's probably a reason. So I'll be here ready to do the work when anyone else is.
I work with many queer folks who struggle to get their needs met or who suffer from having their boundaries violated by others. Because you may not have been cared for the best, you might have a hard time identifying your needs. Or because you have been violated or bullied, you might not completely understand where exactly your boundaries are. If you'd like some help exploring your needs and building more resilient boundaries, head over to my website and download the free guide, Needs, Boundaries, and Self-Care Support for Queer Folks. This is a short introduction to help you start to shift and change your relationship to yourself and others, and to feel more safe and resourced day to day. So just head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/needs to download your free guide today. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.